Hello, and welcome to the HDSA Caregivers Corner webinar. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Chung-Ho Cha, who will be presenting on living positively with HD. Dr. Cha has served as a member of the HDSA Coalition for the Cure, a member of the HDSA Board of Trustees, and chair of the Center of Programs and Education Advisory Committee. Before I invite Dr. Cha to begin, I'd like to take a moment to review how you can ask a question and how to access the webinar after this broadcast. Questions will be answered during the presentation. However, you may send a question anytime. Questions will be answered after the presentation. However, you may send a question anytime during the presentation. To send a question, just go to the control panel that appears on the right-hand side of the screen. Access the panel for typing in a question, and after you type it in, press the send button. To access this webinar again, approximately 48 to 72 hours after broadcast, you can go to the HDSA national website. Just go to hdsa.org and scroll down to the home page until you come to the link for the webinar. There will be an accompanying PowerPoint presentation that will allow you to print the slides, as well as a PDF file of additional information. Older webinars are also archived in the Living with HD section. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cha.
Okay. Great. Hang on just a second. I'm just going to get our terrific. You know what? I need to do one thing here, which is to, sorry, I thought I had this turned off, but I don't. Just get rid of this. While I'm closing all my windows here, I'd just like to thank Manelli and Jane for inviting me to reprise this talk that I had the chance to give at the convention, and I was asked to do a workshop which on living at risk, and it was really kind of an interesting task because it was they were asking me to talk about alternative therapies, and there's just not a lot of data out there. So this is what I was able to come up with, and I think, is everyone seeing my title slide here? Oh, I realize that that you guys cannot talk back to me, and I wish I could have that arrangement with my kids. But I see that you're seeing it, and so I'm going to be controlling the slides from here. And first, I'm going to start off with my disclosures. So I am currently an employee of Merck Research Laboratories, although there are no Merck products that I'm going to talk about. I've also served as on the medical advisory board for Lundbeck, but those are my disclosures. The HDSA general disclosure here is, again, left over from the convention program, but it's important to note that you should check with your physician. I am going to discuss some medications and some supplements, but the disclaimer is that really no medications have been approved to slow the progression or delay the onset of HD. Nevertheless, I'm going to discuss some of them, but just realize that some of this will be speculation. I'd like to start off just providing you a little bit of background on me and my interest in Huntington's disease. I'm a neurologist, and I also have a research degree, and I've done basic science research in Huntington's disease. And I first got involved with Huntington's disease by going to Venezuela and working on the Venezuela project. For the past 17 years, I've been a neurologist and a neuroscientist at Mass General Hospital in Boston. But my involvement with HDSA goes back quite a long way. They gave me my first traveling fellowship award as a postdoctoral fellow in 1997, and I got a research fellowship in 98. And for the past 10 years, I've been one of the Coalition for the Cure investigators. And most recently, I've been serving on the board of trustees as the chair of the CPAC committee. And earlier this year, I moved to Merck Research Laboratories, working on development of new treatments for neurologic and psychiatric diseases. So that is me. And we'll go right into the presentation now. And the question is really, what can you do if you are at risk? So if you have a parent with HD, what's the best kind of available formula that we know about? And before we start with what we know, I'm going to start off what we don't know and where we are. So in 2010, we have nothing yet proven to slow the progression or delay the onset of HD. Obviously, that's a really important thing that we need to get to, but we're just not there yet. There's some important questions, though, and there's, as everyone knows, there's a lot of progress in this arena, and we think that there is going to be something that slows the progression or delays the onset in HD patients. But then the question is, once something is shown to slow the progression in a symptomatic HD patient, what will the effect of that be in somebody who's gene positive who may not be manifesting symptoms? So imagine that there's a treatment that finally gets approved, and that's the day that we're hoping for. When would you start that treatment? Now remember that you can diagnose this gene status very early, from the day that somebody's born. But every drug, whether it's aspirin or Avandia, has side effects, and the side effects are likely cumulative. That is, the longer you take the medication, the longer you'll have side effects. So when do you start a treatment? Would you start it the day somebody's born? Well, somebody could go 40 or 50 years with no problems, and if you're starting them on a treatment that has some side effects, are you just exposing that individual to 40 or 50 years of side effects without any benefit because that person is normal? Part of this is, gee, wouldn't you like to know when your disease is really starting? And this is, of course, an active research question, because we don't really know when Huntington starts. And in fact, a big research question that's out there is, what defines the beginning of Huntington's disease? You can imagine a situation where you have a treatment that has some sort of toxicity, and every medication does have some toxicity, that maybe you'd want to start it right at the first sign of the disease. Well, in order to do that, you have to know what the first sign of the disease is. So, and we don't know these things, and obviously it's important. So that gets me to my first commercial, which is get involved in research. These questions that I've raised, like when does HD start, how does it begin, we can get those answers, but we need people with HD and people who are gene positive to participate in research trials, and especially the observational trials. So I'd make a commercial to get involved, or if you're thinking about it, or if you want to know how you can help, you can go to hdtrials.org, and at the end of this presentation, there's a list of resources. There are also several ongoing observational trials where people can submit themselves to regular exams, so we can gather this important data, so we can get ourselves ready for when a treatment is available, because these are important questions. Okay, moving from what we don't know, one of the questions I get a lot is, what supplements should I take? And for those of you who are on the call, and you can see this, that some of these are going to look familiar to you. You've heard about creatine or blueberries or ginkgo and minocycline, and should you take them or not? And there's a long list, and if you don't see your favorite supplement on here, please excuse me. I've kept it kind of short on purpose, but you get the idea. There's a lot that's out there that there's some report that it's beneficial. So, what do you do about supplements? So, before we jump into it, the questions that I'd like to ask everyone listening, and if we were in a live room, I'd ask you to raise your hands, but how many people here are taking supplements, right? And we can't get an answer, but when I talk to a live audience, and I know you're live, but it's probably about 50% of the people are taking something. And then how many people think supplements work? Obviously, if you're taking supplements, it would be nice to know if they work. And then finally, boy, wouldn't you like to have more definite proof about whether supplements work or not, right? I'm going to make a pitch for the second commercial, which is HD DrugWorks. HD DrugWorks is an organization that's run by LaVon Veach Goodman, and she and her organization are very interested in collecting the experiences of individual patients taking various supplements with the idea that, look, there are people who are taking these things anyway, why don't we find out what happens to them? So if any of you are taking supplements, I encourage you to go to this website and get your experience registered, because, boy, if there's something out there that's really working, let's get that information and figure it out. Also, it's important to figure out if something really doesn't work, right? So let's get back to the issue of supplements. And when I'm seeing patients, I'll often get this question. Gee, doc, something has been shown to help HD mice. And there's actually a long list of things which have been beneficial in the mice, either making them live longer or improving their movements, improving their motor performance. There's been a report in a scientific journal, or you saw something in your paper saying that a chemical has helped HD mice. So what are the kinds of things you would like to know? Okay, you have the observation that the mice are helped by this substance. Well, usually the first question is, boy, will this drug work in humans? And obviously, it works in mice. It's very hopeful, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in people. Well, what's the right dose, right? And most of the reports showing that something's helped in mice will not tell you what the right dose in humans. I don't need to tell you that the same doses that are effective in mice are not necessarily the same dose you would use in people for any medication, whether it's an HD medication or not. Is this drug safe? And really, that's got to be the top consideration for the FDA, which approves drugs. This is the #1 question: is it safe? Is it harmful? So, could there be any damage from taking these medications or these substances? What are the long-term side effects? If you take something, how will you know if it's working? How will you know if it's working? Now, most people listening know that HD does not get worse day by day. It typically doesn't get worse week by week. It might get worse month by month, maybe year by year. So if you have something that stops it, how will you know? You won't know the next day. You might know, you probably won't know the next week. A year later, you might say, yeah, you're a little bit worse than you were, but not quite as bad if you hadn't been on the drug. So figuring out if something's working or not is really difficult. So if you imagine that Huntington's disease is kind of like rust on a car. So it kind of doesn't change very much day to day, but over a year or so, you can see that that rust is spreading more and more. And let's say that your treatment is like a rust inhibitor. And you spray that rust inhibitor on, and even if it stops it dead in its tracks, you won't know the difference. You won't notice the difference the next day. You probably won't notice the difference the next week. You might notice the difference, I don't know, in 6 months or a year. So actually figuring out if something is an effective rust inhibitor can be very difficult. And that's assuming that it's 100% effective. What if your Rust inhibitor is only 50% effective? Well, for HD, that would still be pretty good. If we could slow something down by 50%, that would be pretty good. But it might be very difficult to figure out if it's really working or not. And then another question that I always want to know, and it is, has another laboratory reproduced this result? And why is that important? Has another laboratory reproduced this result? And I have to get a little bit nerdy here and talk about publication bias. And it's just let the buyer beware. So the scientific literature publishing in these journals, it's much easier to publish a positive result than a negative result. And the reality of doing science is most things that you try don't work. Okay, every now and then something will work by chance alone. That is, if you just repeat something, it'll appear to work. So, and if you can get something to work, you can have a good chance of getting it published. So, wouldn't other scientists kind of immediately check out if that's true or not? And it turns out there's little incentive to repeat the work of other scientists. Number one, it's not as prestigious. Okay, so if you've just repeated the work and you confirmed the finding of another scientist, everyone's like, okay, yeah, whatever, we already knew that. If you fail to repeat the work of others, let's say Professor Smith has published a study and I tried to do the same study in my HD mice and it doesn't work, well, Professor Smith might be angry at me. And if I show that it definitively doesn't work, that's usually not the path to more grant funding. Now remember, all these scientists need to get research grants in order to keep their operations going. So disproving something doesn't lead to funding. Of course, it's important to figure out if something's real or not. It's just not very much of this replication work, this checking of results. Not very much of it happens. So just because something is published doesn't mean it's real. And boy, wouldn't we like to know if something is really reliable or not. But unfortunately, I've got to say that a lot of things that have been published have not held up. And it's hard to find the examples of people who are failing to replicate those studies because by and large, many of those studies don't get published. Okay, so I'm going to talk about creatine and coenzyme Q10 specifically because there's a little bit of evidence about them. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about my recommendation regarding supplements. And here it is. For the most part, I don't know enough about the safety and efficacy, and that's really whether something works or not, to recommend supplements for symptomatic or pre-symptomatic HD patients. So my honest answer for most people is I don't know. And they'll say, is this good for me? And I'll say to them, I don't know. And then they'll say, well, at least it's not going to be harmful. And I'll say to them, I don't know that it's not harmful. There's a lot of things that you think ought to be safe which prove not to be safe later on, whether it's natural substances or medications. By the way, it's important to point out that just because something is natural does not mean it's safe for you. Strychnine is natural. Arsenic is natural, and they can kill you. So it's not very satisfying for me to tell a patient or a family, gee, I don't know about the supplements. It's just the truth. It's the best answer I can come up with. Boy, wouldn't I like to know more about this. Yeah, absolutely. But if I don't know, I can't tell you that it's going to be safer. I can't tell you it's going to harm you. I think that I would love for there to be more studies about this. But for the vast majority of supplements, I think we just don't have enough information to go on. Okay. On the other hand, we have a little bit of information to go on for creatine and coenzyme Q10, and for that reason, I just want to go into those substances a little bit more in depth because these are common questions that I get. The first is creatine. And this is a widely used nutritional supplement. In fact, it's very popular with athletes, and the reason that it is it does increase muscle. A lot of college and professional athletes use creatine to build muscle and add strength. And there's a real logical reason why creatine could be helpful in Huntington's disease. So creatine definitely helps cells by boosting energy, and specifically it helps the mitochondria produce more energy. Now, one of the major thoughts in Huntington's disease is that one of the problems in HD is that cells, and especially brain cells, have a problem in producing enough energy. If you give creatine to HD mice, you have the following observations, that the HD mice taking creatine have a delayed onset of symptoms and they live longer, right? So that's pretty interesting. I've got to say that not everyone has been able to come up with this result. There are some laboratories which have done this experiment with mice and they don't see the benefit of creatine. But you know, you have something which is widely used since, you know, thousands and thousands of people are taking it, most of whom don't have HD. It's probably likely to be safe just because there's been so much human experience with creatine, all these athletes taking it. So, and you have this evidence that, gee, it might be helpful in mice. So, you know, will it work in humans? Well, again, some of those questions, what would you like to know? Well, we probably think it's safe, although it's certainly worth a closer look. What's the right dose? Gee, we don't really know what the right dose is. You know, how beneficial could it be? Well, if we're kind of making a guess based on the animal studies, we think that it might have the potential to be a little bit beneficial, but not hugely beneficial. The mice who are getting fed the creatine are still dying of a mouse version of HD. So we know that it doesn't cure HD, but there's still a possibility that it could be useful in terms of alleviating symptoms. So as many of you know, creatine has been used in human HD trials. So the one that's ongoing now is CREST-E, which is run by the Huntington Study Group. And this is a trial where folks with symptomatic HD are given high doses of creatine, and they're observed for safety, make sure that it's safe, and to see if it's slowing down their the progression of their disease. We don't have the answers to that yet, but we'll keep our eye on that study. You know, anecdotally, and I know a lot of people are taking creatine. I think it's fine for people to take creatine. I don't know that it's helpful for people, but I do not dissuade anyone from taking it because I personally believe it's probably safe just because there's been such a huge experience in the non-HD population taking this medication. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about coenzyme Q10. This is also called CoQ10. And in some ways, this is very similar to creatine in that, like creatine, the CoQ10 is thought to help cells by boosting energy, again, by allowing mitochondria, which are the parts of the cell which generate energy, by allowing those mitochondria to produce more energy. And similar to the evidence that we've got for creatine, if you give CoQ10 to mice, it delays the onset of symptoms and extends lifespan. So again, questions that come up, you know, will it work in humans? That this has been looked at, right? So here's some of the things that we do know. We know that it's really expensive, and depending on what the dose is, it could be several $100s a month. Again, we don't know what the right dose is because we don't know if it's effective at all. But we do know that if we're, you know, kind of paying attention to the mouse studies, that the amount of benefit will probably be limited. So again, it's not going to be a cure. but coenzyme Q10 is an area of active investigation. So on commercial number 4, there are 2 studies that are ongoing, both run by the Huntington Study Group, which is a consortium of HD clinics within the U.S., Australia, and Europe, and Canada. And one is the 2CARE study, which is a study of high-dose coenzyme Q10 in symptomatic patients, but also prequel. And this is now a study of coenzyme Q10 in pre-symptomatic subjects, and really starting to get at that question of, if you give something to somebody before they have obvious symptoms, will it be helpful? So we don't know the answer. Obviously, the results of these trials will be very interesting, and we await those answers. But all these things that I'm raising as questions, there's a way to get at these answers. That's what scientists do, right? So the way you get at the questions, you run the trial. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now and jump away from supplements and really talk about some other things that you can do, because it's very clear that medications or supplements are not the only way, they're not the only thing that one can do. And I just want to tell you a little bit of something that we've been working on in my lab, which is a little bit interesting. And this dates back to an observation that was published in the year 2000 by Anton van Dellen and Tony Hannon. They were at Oxford in England. And they are looking at a phenomenon called environmental enrichment. And basically, environmental enrichment works in Huntington's mice. Now, normally, laboratory mice are kept in little plastic cages with sawdust bedding and food and water, and that's it. For a mouse, if they put them into an enriched environment, and this is a slightly larger cage, more mice per cage, so they have these social interactions with other mice, and the enriched environment really consists of nothing more than changing a toy in their cage every 3 days. So every 3 days they switch a toy, and it could be a tube or a cube that they climb on. That and these hello? Hi.
Okay, so it's just instructions on how to load one. Got it.
Okay, I'm hearing a little echo there, but anyway, so what they did was they took some HD mice and they put half of them into the regular environment and half of them into the enriched environment. And the results are here on the next slide. So on the top panel, where you have the red line, the blue line, and the green line, this is a motor scale where the higher numbers are worse. So what you see is that that the non-HD mice, which are in red, they're at 0, which is normal as they age from 40 to 100 days, and they just always stay at 0, which on this scale is normal. The HD mice, though, in green, on the other hand, get progressively worse over time.
All of them?
All the HD mice. All the HD mice get worse over time. Okay. However, when you look at the HD mice which are enriched, and these are, the brothers and sisters of the green mice, this is now in blue. So the HD mice who have been in an enriched environment stay very much closer to the regular mice, the normal mice. So remember, these mice have not been given any medications, any supplements, but they look better on this motor performance just by having an enriched environment. And in fact, they have less brain shrinkage as well. So we've been collaborating with this group, and this is an article that we just published in August, and it's a long title, but we've looked at kind of what's happening to the brain of these mice that undergo environmental enrichment. And because we figured that if environmental enrichment is making these mice behave better, it must be having some effect on the brain. So we analyzed the brains of some of these mice that had undergone enrichment and compared them to brains of mice that had not undergone enrichment. And here's just one picture. So what you see these are microscopic pictures of mouse brain, and in the non-enriched brain we have 3 pictures, one from the CA1 area of the hippocampus, another one from the CA3 area of the hippocampus, and one from the cerebellar granular layer. And you won't know this, but all these black dots there are abnormal protein deposits. They're abnormal protein deposits which shouldn't be in a normal brain at all, but these deposits are, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but I'm pointing these black dots, really shouldn't be there, but they're present in the brains of the HD mice. And similar types of these black dots are present in human brains with HD. And these are abnormal aggregates of Huntington protein. Well, it turns out that if you take other mice and you put them in enriched conditions, look what happens. And you can see on the right panel that the number of those inclusions, those abnormal inclusions, just melts away. So living in an enriched environment has this profound effect on the brain, and you have a big reduction in these abnormal-looking deposits. These are kind of like scars in the brain. So you say this to a normal person, and they're like, fine, yeah, of course. You say this to a neuroscientist, they're a little bit blown away. So, you know, I look at this and say, wow, what do you think environmental enrichment will do to your brain? That's pretty cool. Remember, this is something that, you know, doesn't involve any medications. Just on the next slide is another figure. This is another quantitation of those abnormal deposits. And the non-enriched mice are in the open squares. And you can see in 6 different brain areas that over time they get more and more of these aggregates, the protein blobs. But in the enriched mice, you can see that the rate of the protein blobs are decreased. So you talk about a rust inhibitor. It looks like environmental enrichment is kind of its own rust inhibitor. So think about that. It's like we're not giving any other medication. We're just having that animal just be in an enriched environment, doing more stuff, and the brain looks a lot better. So, you know, what's the take-home message? I think the way that you interact with the environment modifies how the mutant protein affects your brain. I'm saying even though I'm presenting evidence that's just from mice, but I really believe that this type of effect that you see in mice is very likely happens in people, that if you use your brain, it's better for your brain. So but that leads to the question, okay, does environmental enrichment work in humans? Well, I'd first ask anyone who's come from an HD family, what do you think? What do you think? You guys have experience with this. There is a little bit of experience recorded with humans. We published a paper a few years ago when I had mentioned this result to a nurse I was working with, Florinda Sullivan. I said, oh, the enrichment makes the mice live longer and they do better. She said, oh, we knew that. I said, well, what do you mean you knew that? I said, well, when I worked with on the HD unit at Middlesex, we did remotivation therapy. And I said, well, what's remotivation therapy? So she educated me, and remotivation therapy is a discipline in which the clients or patients approaches individuals and seeking those individual factors that can help them motivate. For some people, it's finding out that they connect with music. For other people, whatever interests them, and drawing them out. So in this study, and it wasn't a scientific study, but it was their patient observations, the patients receiving the remotivation therapy required less staffing and achieved higher functional levels, required less assistance to do things. And again, no medications required. This is just kind of an interactional type of intervention. So, I think that the environmental enrichment, people always ask me about supplements, but I'm like, hey, I think there are some things that you can do even without supplements. And it turns out that environmental enrichment or exercise especially, is showing up as beneficial in a number of neurologic diseases. I don't have time to review all the evidence for this, but increasingly Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, that people do better and in some cases delay the onset of their symptoms if they stay mentally and physically active. I think that it's very reasonable to think about this in Huntington's disease. So I'm winding my way down to kind of what is it that I kind of recommend to folks. And here are my best guesses. They're educated guesses, but these are really guesses. What's the best formula for what you should do? I really believe that daily exercise for folks who are at risk or folks with HD is a must. And when people say, well, how much exercise? Well, any is better than none, and more is better than some. But I shoot for at least 30 minutes a day for 6 days a week, and the equivalent of walking for 30 minutes a day. I also say that people have to use their brains. They have to be mentally engaged. And people say, well, what's the best thing to do? Should I do crosswords? I don't know for sure what the best thing to do is, but my guess is that like physical exercise, the best mental exercise is one that you like and you're going to stick with. So some people like swimming and some people like playing tennis and some people like jogging. I think for mental activity, some people whatever you're going to do with and get your brain engaged. For some people, it's bird watching. For other people, it's reading. I think probably just like exercise, it's not so important what type of activity you do, but that you do something. Another thing that I'm increasingly convinced of is that sleep is a really, really important factor, not just for folks with HD, but for everyone. It turns out that the data are the lack of sleep is as harmful to your health as smoking on overall mortality. So I think that getting adequate sleep is really important. And then finally, I say, look, I would consider taking creatine and or coenzyme Q10. The evidence is incomplete, but if it were me, I would at least consider it. It's not clearly definite enough that I can insist upon it, but I think that it's only fair that that I let people know that these supplements are out there and are being considered. So, exercise, mental activity, sleep, maybe taking some supplements. But if you boil that down, really persons at risk for HD should probably be doing what we all should be doing, which is, this is a recipe for everyone, not just folks who come from HD families. I'm just about winding up here. These slides will be available on the website. I've put all the resources, so you don't need to run around and scribble these down. But those are the resources, and I want to make sure that we leave enough room for questions. So if people have questions, they're going to be sent to me, and I will read the questions, and then we'll talk about them. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, great. This is Jane Kogan again. As I mentioned earlier, to send a question, you just go to the control panel, type in the question, and hit the send button.
Okay, so we're just waiting for questions to roll in. As I said, this is the presentation that I gave at the convention in North Carolina. So I can tell you what certain of the questions were. I mean, I think some people were surprised about the point about scientific publication bias, because there were people in the room who were not scientists and had just thought that every experiment that was done would be faithfully reported in the scientific literature, and that's actually not the case, and scientists tend to publish only the stuff that works. So for any given supplement, if you look it up, and you'll find positive reports, because oftentimes the negative reports won't get published at all. So you'll be left with, doing your search on PubMed.gov, saying, yeah, this supplement X seems to be beneficial, and I can't find any negative reports. So that's a big problem. Okay. Okay, so I've got some questions here. I see. Okay, let me just read through this. Okay, so I'm just going to read the question here. If a person who is diagnosed at age 19 years and they have a CAG of repeat number of 50, does that mean they usually will get symptoms at an early age? Oh, there's a whole bunch of questions here. Okay, so the first question is kind of about the relationship between the CAG repeats and the age of onset. And interestingly, there is a relationship that's a very general relationship that is the higher number of repeats, the earlier the age of onset. Okay? But that's kind of like saying, in general, it's warmer in the summer than it is in the winter. Okay? Because it turns out that the CAG repeat number is not, for any individual, is not a very good predictor. For example, if somebody has 44 repeats, I can tell them that their age of onset probably will be between the ages of 25 and 65. That's not really a very useful range. It turns out that a better predictor of the age of onset of a person is the age of onset that their parent had. And you don't, and in order to get that, you don't need to know what the repeat number is. So again, that's an example of where the CAG repeat number gives you some information, but maybe not as much as you would like. I think there's another question about, as for taking supplements, how many supplements should you take? Should you take more than one? Boy, I really don't know. Let me give you an I don't know about that, because I don't even know about single supplements. When you combine them, there's the chance that there's interactions between them, and for the most part, those are really legitimate questions for which we don't have the answer. Okay. There's a question about the smoking data. I think you're referring to the sleep data, and I don't have the reference for that handy, but I can track that down. Okay. Good question. How much of enrichment comes from exercise and how much comes from mental stimulation? Do we know from the mouse study? That's a really good question. We don't know. Some people have said, well, compared to a laboratory mouse, humans are already living in an enriched environment, so additional enrichment won't be beneficial at all. I think that's possible, but I am also thinking, gee, if you can get any benefit just by enriching the environment, wouldn't that be worth looking at? So I think it's totally reasonable not to equate the mouse environmental enrichment with the type of enrichment you could do with a human being, but I also think that the human brain is a lot more complex, and we do a lot more processing, such that I think there might even be a chance that enrichment might be more beneficial in humans. It's just kind of uncharted territory. And in the in the mouse study, some studies have been done where they just exercise the mice, and clearly just physical exercise alone is not as good as this overall stimulation. So I think that is part of the answer, that probably is not only physical but also mental stimulation. But it's hard to ask a mouse how much mental stimulation they're getting. There's a question about somebody who's losing a lot of weight and who doesn't eat well at all. What can you do to keep the weight up? And the simplest answer is it's a matter of calories. So if someone is losing weight, and this is typically a person who's already symptomatic, who's had HD for a few years, you got to provide them calories. You got to provide them calories, and sometimes it takes a long time to get those calories into people. There was a study that was done in Scotland a number of years ago for institutionalized patients, and the conclusion there was that if you provided these nursing home residents who had HD to access to calories, even though it might take an aide a lot longer to feed them, because many of these patients required one-to-one feeding, that those patients could do much, much better. So the first answer is make sure that they have access to calories, and it might mean that you have to sit with them for an hour to get a meal into them. If there is really a lack of appetite, there are some appetite stimulants which can be helpful. Again, you'd need to go to your physician to do that. And sometimes the use of nutritional supplements is really helpful, like the Ensure sometimes is really helpful. Okay, there's a question for DHA. DHA is an abbreviation for DHA is dodecahexanoic acid, and that's one of the fish oil compounds. And there have been some trials for DHA, and they're very underwhelming. So the DHA, which looked like it was beneficial in mice, in people it doesn't really work at all. There's a minor effect in some subgroup, but this type of analysis, which is done after the study, is usually not very convincing. So I think there have been trials for DHA. They're really disappointing. Okay, so there's a question about vitamin E. This is a good one. Okay. So vitamin E, it used to be thought that vitamin E would be good for everything that ails you. In the 1990s, people thought that vitamin E would be good for Alzheimer's, Huntington's, colon cancer, and so forth. So and cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks. And the reason was, in all those diseases, there is thought to be a problem with free radicals. Free radicals are inflammation molecules which we're always generating in our bodies. And in all those processes, like cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's, there's evidence of free radical damage. So the idea is vitamin E, which is a natural antioxidant, so it sucks up the free radicals, ought to be protective. And there were some early studies that showed that, in fact, they were beneficial. And so at one point, it was our practice to prescribe vitamin E to everybody. After a number of those studies came out, there was an analysis where they looked at every study where vitamin E was being prescribed. And this is for heart attacks, for Alzheimer's, for colon cancer, etc. So everyone who's getting vitamin E, it looks like in that analysis, the people taking vitamin E actually had more mortality, especially in the cardiovascular group. So even though the evidence in the 1990s was like, hey, vitamin E might be good for you, and what's the harm, a more careful analysis of vitamin E, and it is a vitamin, so everyone was thinking that it would be safe for you, shows that there is a slight but definite increase in mortality. So I've backed away from the vitamin E because there's not clear evidence that it's really beneficial at all, and now there's definite evidence that it's a little bit harmful, not hugely harmful, but so I think that's a big surprise to everyone. I think in 1995, no one would have thought that vitamin E would be harmful, and everyone's thinking, gee, vitamin E is a wonder drug, it's going to work for everything, and the worm has turned on that one. So that's a cautionary tale, not just for vitamin E, but for any of these supplements. You're always going to have an initial round of things that sound pretty good, but later on, once you get some more information, it turns out not to be good. So I personally used to take vitamin E. I no longer take it. So there's a question about kids with juvenile HD. So folks with juvenile HD, and this is a really good question. Should JHD kids be studied separately because the disease progresses faster in them and the results are more significant? So really, it's a great question because maybe the same things that work for adults with HD might not work for kids with HD because there are some differences. I think probably juvenile HD should be studied separately. It's a lot more difficult. Number one, the FDA is not very they're not very excited about doing studies in children because that's a special population. Of course, these are children with special disease. One of the big problems in all these clinical trials, and when you say clinical trial, this is a study that involves actual people, actual patients, is the clinical trials are having difficulty getting enough people to sign up for them. If you don't have enough people, you won't get an answer. So that's a difficulty with HD patients, HD clinical trials in general. It would be even more of a difficulty for juvenile HD because there are not as many of those subjects around, and a lot of them are would not be suitable for studies because they're too sick. So I think there's a big challenge, but the essential point of the question is, isn't there something different about juvenile? Yeah, that's true. I think what's probably going to happen is you're going to find something that works for adult HD first and see if it works secondarily in kids, and that's what's happened a lot in cancer chemotherapy, for example, where something is tried out first in the adult population and then introduced to kids. So so here's a question, it's again about age of onset. I'll just read this out loud. You stated that the CAG repeat numbers that are a high number do not necessarily mean they'll get an onset of symptoms sooner. You stated that a better determination is the age of parents first got their symptoms. What percentage is this true that a child will get the symptoms at the same age as their parent? Well, I think it's about roughly about 90% of the people, that might be a little high, but let's say 75% of folks who would get their age of onset, for about 75% of them, it'll be within 5 years of the age of onset of the parent. So it tracks pretty closely, okay? But there's a big old asterisk in here, okay? And as many of you know, the age of onset in the parent or the grandparent can be very, very slippery. And we don't, and sometimes it wasn't known in the family, and or it was hidden. So you know, all of that depends on accurately knowing what the age of onset in a parent is. But so it's hard to get very precise, and this is like saying, well, you know, what's the weather going to be like 3 weeks from today? Well, I can make a guess, but there's going to be some variability. I think we're winding up to the end of it. I'll take one more question, which is fish oil beneficial in HD? I'm going to say I don't know. All the evidence that I see so far is no. I wish it were, because that would be great, but I would say the evidence there is just not good news on fish oil. Again, the DHA is not fish oil. It's a component of fish oil. Fish oil is made up of a lot of different chemicals. The DHA is thought to be kind of the active ingredient, but that turns out to be disappointing. Fish oil in general, the studies really haven't been done, but I haven't seen anything that suggests to me that the fish oil is beneficial. I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I'll toss it back to Jane or Manelli.
Thank you, Chung-Ho. As I said earlier, this webinar will be posted on the HDSA national website in 48 to 72 hours. So if you want to view it again, you will be able to do so. And thank you again for attending. And thank you, Chung-Ho, for the great presentation.
I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today and for their questions. They're great ones. Okay, bye, everybody.